Friends, it's good to be with you for the last in this year's series, really last year's series of conversations with the clerk. Tonight, we're talking about the proposed amendments to the Book of Order that came out of last summer's General Assembly. Um, I'm going to do a couple of things here. As we get started, I'm going to put in the chat a couple of resources that might be helpful. First of all, is a one-page guide to the amendments. This is from another stated clerk in Baltimore Presbytery. I have tweaked it a little bit, and it's just helpful sometimes to have everything on one page with about a sentence that describes what it's about. So as you think about this, as you look at the amendments, as you talk with others, you can make a note here of your thoughts. Um, Thought this might be helpful for you. I've also put a link to the amendment book, which it contains the full text of all of the amendments. This is the English version. There are versions available in Spanish and Korean as well if you need those. So I want to also mention that our presentation tonight is going to be focused on all but two of the amendments. So tonight we are not going to be talking a lot about amendments 24A and 24C. These are the two amendments that were discussed in another conversations with the clerk last summer. And because these two amendments were related to what was called Polity 01, it was an item of business. And so we talked about those more quickly after the General Assembly because there was interest in having those conversations. So if you want to learn more about 24A and 24C, I encourage you to go look up that conversations with the clerk. The link is in the chat. If you're watching this later, you can see it along the way. It's in our YouTube channel. Happy. And if you have other questions, you can always send me an email and I'll happily direct you wherever you're going. So what I'm going to do, I've got a presentation here mostly to show us the full text of the amendments. But those are also in that amendment book that you have. But sometimes it's just helpful to have it on the screen as we go through this. So we'll dive right in with Amendment 24B. This proposes a new section for the Book of Order at G-10104, talking about other forms of corporate witness. So G101, that section of the Book of Order, talks about congregations. And this would add another section to talk about worshiping communities. The language is, there's two, I've got this text split onto two slides. I'm going to read it out loud because sometimes it's just helpful to have it that way. In circumstances where the formation of a traditional ecclesiastically and legally organized congregation is not desired or deemed appropriate, and a worshiping community has been formally recognized by a presbytery according to its own definition, presbyteries and congregations may work together with such a group to provide supervision and support. Such recognized groups shall be under the mutually agreed upon oversight of a minister of the word and sacrament approved by the presbytery, shall include at least one ruling elder in their chosen leadership, and shall function under the financial, legal, and disciplinary sponsorship of an ecclesial council, either a session or a presbytery. The sponsoring council shall, in consultation with the worshiping community, authorize any celebrations of the sacraments within the group in accordance with the directory for worship. Membership records for group participants desiring to be formally enrolled as baptized, active, or affiliate members in the PCUSA shall be maintained by the sponsoring council. Such groups shall not hold property and may not undertake any financial, legal, or contractual obligations apart from their sponsoring council. They shall adhere to the sponsoring council's required policies on sexual misconduct, harassment, child and youth protection, and anti-racism. Presbyteries shall determine appropriate means of representation and participation of such groups in and through the sponsoring councils, session, and/or presbytery. Whew. This is the longest amendment proposed this year, so we're starting out with the hard stuff. I want to first mention that our new Church Development Commission in the Presbytery has been talking about this, and we're working with them to have some information to share at the Presbytery meeting on February 8th that they so that you can get their perspective on it. There are some things that they really appreciate about this amendment, and then they have some concerns about other things in it. This amendment is intended to make space for worshiping communities who may or may not intend to become congregations. It's also possible, another understanding of this that was mentioned at General Assembly, it's also possible that a congregation might decide to dissolve as a congregation and become a worshiping community at the end of its life to simplify its structures and processes. So the hope is that this amendment would provide a reformed structure and polity and clarify some connections and accountability to presbytery or session. And it provides for administration of the sacraments and um, and for a process for discipline. Now, one of the things you'll get a little bit from me tonight is some questions that I may have on this because I can't stand up. I'm not going to stand up on the floor at Presbytery and tell you what I think. I'm going to try not to do that tonight too. But I this amendment raises some questions from me as your stated clerk. Um, One of the phrases that sticks out to me when I read this amendment is that the community is under the oversight of a minister of the word and sacrament. What does that mean? This is not something that we have in our polity anywhere. Oversight is something that in our foundational polity belongs to groups of people, not to individuals. Another question I have is whether is how well the policies that are being assigned to these groups on sexual misconduct, child and youth protection, and anti-racism, how well those from the presbytery or a session, how well those actually fit a worshiping community. These communities are intentionally not congregations because they need some flexibility. And usually these policies at the presbytery level are a lot more complicated. Um, we might have to make some special policies for that. Um, and the last question I have is what complications might there be when sessions have authority to supervise and maybe even create these kinds of communities? Normally, this work has resided with the presbytery. And when a church wants to do some of this work in its context, it does it with the blessing of presbytery in some very specific ways. And I wonder what that might look like under this amendment because it's not particularly clear. So those are the questions that I have at this point about it. I would open the floor now. We'll pause after each one of these and see if you have questions for conversation or discussion or things you want further clarification on. I'll try to do my best.
Well, this is Margaret from St. Andrews, and I guess I'm wondering what, without I'm not asking for specifics of places or people or whatever, but what precipitated or what kinds of situations precipitated an amendment like this?
That's a great question. Thanks, Margaret. And it looks like Martha may have a similar question because she put her hand down. The precipitating piece of this is that it's kind of broad based. Over the last few years, as new worshiping communities have become, and these different expressions of church have become more common, where groups may not be on a trajectory toward becoming congregations, in the way that new church developments, it was assumed that a new church development was going to be a congregation. So we're going to create their structures in a way that might get them there. And more we're seeing our new worshiping communities in this presbytery and across the church. take forms and shapes that don't look like our traditional congregations. And so the hope and prayer and goal of this amendment, there have been a couple of others that came to the General Assembly before, was to create some space so that people could gain voice in the governance of the church. We could learn from our friends in these spaces who are doing incredible kinds of ministry, very often from a Presbyterian and Reformed perspective. It just doesn't look like what we're used to. And so I think the goal of it was to give voice within our polity and system for that. One of the things that has repeatedly come up is you can't have a voice in our system if you're not subject to it. So you must always be subject to the discipline of the church if you're going to be in the church. And so so that's one of the pieces that shows up in in this amendment. You can see this extended comment about where that somebody's got to take on the discipline of these folks. So if they're going to be PCUSA members. So I think that gets to some of the pieces that contributed to it. I hope that's helpful. Um, I can try to answer other questions. Yeah, Lee.
Do we have an example of this that I always learn by somebody giving me an example of what we're talking about?
I mean, I think in some ways it would be a substantial example of the biggest example would be one of our new worshiping communities. Another might be a small congregation that decides that they no longer need to exist in the way that they have historically existed. They close their doors or dissolve as a congregation, maybe even sell their property, but keep coming together as a worshiping community and want to have continuing engagement in the life of the broader church. So I think those are two possible paths for it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, Tully, I see your hand.
Who would pay the per capita for members of
Hmm.
such an organization?
I do not know. I don't know that it would actually be subject to per capita in those spaces because there is not a process to report, at least at this point, the number of members who would be in that group. If this was approved, I think presbyteries would be required to report the membership, and actually congregations as well, because it's a sponsoring council, so it would be a session and a presbytery. We would be asked to report the number of members who are part of worshiping communities. Yeah. Russ?
Would this be inclusive of all of our NCDC folks, or uh, uh, the particular question that's on my heart is with El Buen Pastor.
Mhm.
They don't have a sponsoring ordained minister of word and sacrament. Where do they fall in all of this?
So I think there is a lack of clarity at this point with this amendment. When I first read this amendment, I said, and this is very clearly Andy James, stated clerk, but Andy James speaking. I said we could probably keep our existing new worshiping communities, and they wouldn't have to be subject to this. We would just say they're not worshiping communities, they're new worshiping communities. I have since that time heard reflection from staff at the General Assembly level who said, no, this is intended to encompass our existing new worshiping communities. So they would have to meet these standards in order to be recognized in this way. So there is a lack of clarity on that question at this point. And that's the kind of thing that only gets sorted out in time, unfortunately. Yeah, William.
Yes, Andy. In these times of declining membership in churches and declining uh, activity with people coming into the fold and so forth, do you think that an extensive uh, uh, presentation of these kind of thoughts might be discouraging for some groups, like a Wayne Pasteur or some smaller churches that are struggling to organize and try to put some meaning into what they're doing. Secondly, who is responsible, what committee, and where is the origin of a presentation like this? Where does this come from?
Sure. So on the first question, I think it is very curious to see the focus on membership that shows up in this item when you consider what you're describing and what we are learning about the emerging generation's interest in being a part of institutions. Um, so it is curious to say the least. Where did this come from? That is a great question. Like all of these items, they came from the General Assembly. They were given to the General Assembly. In most cases, these began with overtures from presbyteries. I can't tell you exactly which presbytery offhand was involved in presenting this one. I could look it up given a couple of minutes, maybe, or a couple of seconds, maybe even if the link's not working like I hoped it would. But yeah, this was presented by one of our presbyteries around the country. So,
Thank you.
sure, great questions. Yeah, Polly.
Sorry, I can't find the raise your hand icon.
That's okay.
Thanks. This might have been mentioned at the beginning because this is a long amendment. Of course, I just see this last part of it on here. Is there a definition somewhere for worshiping community?
There is not. So worshiping communities in general, if there is not a clear definition, the definition would be provided by the presbytery.
Okay.
I did flip the slide back just to double check, but yeah.
Yeah, I didn't remember seeing that, but I just thought it might be somewhere and I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah.
Because it does seem very vague in that you could, there wouldn't be anything, like if there's no criteria to be considered a worshiping community, then that really leaves the door wide open for whoever might decide that they are one.
hmm
And I think maybe to one of the concerns that was expressed a few minutes ago, you wouldn't want something that would be a bona fide ministry of an organized congregation that just decided, okay, we don't want to fall under the rules and regulations, so we'll just make ourselves a new community.
Right. So I mean, it would need the group clearly needs to be recognized at least at the beginning by a presbytery, and the definition is decided by the presbytery. So that's the only clarity we've got. But what happens after that is it might only be through a session, and then the presbytery having to exercise authority over a session through very kind of indirect ways. So, Margaret, I see your hand.
Yeah, so how does this differ from the way in which new worshiping communities, happen now? But also in response to Polly, it does seem that these things can't just pop up and say we're this, because they have to have oversight,
Right.
as specified. So
So right now, all of our new worshiping communities are under the authority of the presbytery through the New Church Development Commission.
right.
And they do that work on our behalf in coordination with the rest of the staff and with the broader presbytery. They're connecting with folks in in a lot of different ways, but they provide that oversight, and they provide everything in this except for the discipline. There is a space within our existing polity and the definition of NCDC for them to receive members. Um, but the really the only difference here is the discipline and that phrase of the mutually agreed upon oversight of a minister of the word and sacrament and the inclusion of one ruling elder in their chosen leadership. So that's kind of the big space where it's immediately different from what we do, in addition to allowing a session to be the kind of supervising authority. I could see, for example, like with El Buen Pastor, their great relationship with Good Shepherd would be a natural space potentially to make them kind of the sponsoring council in some ways. Um, but I'm also, but does Good Shepherd want to do that? Does El Buen Pastor want that? I don't know. That would be a conversation, and we would need to have that conversation as the presbytery doing that authority as well. Any last thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Andy, I have a question in regards to being a part now, being a part of or a part of, away from the traditional church.
Mhm.
If part of a ministry decided they wanted to go to become a worship community, would they still remain a part of the church or not?
I think they would. So the best example of something like that that's just popping in my head is the potential for, say, a satellite congregation. So, say one of our congregations feels that it would be appropriate to start a satellite location in another part of the presbytery. That would absolutely require presbytery approval under the Book of Order, under the current Book of Order, and if this were to kick in. But that also might be a really good example of one of these groups. So they could potentially be a satellite could have this worshiping community understanding as well. We don't have one of those right now. I know a couple of our churches have done that in the past, and there are churches that are thinking about it all the time. So, ooh, all right, Callie, I see your hand, Callie. I'm gonna try to ask you to unmute. We can't hear you yet.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
I'm sorry. I was about to say I don't have a question, but I'm not sure I want my feet or our feet held to the fire over something we don't clearly understand. And how long is it going to be? Are we going to allow a group to form and we sanction it before we really know what it's all about?
Hmm. It's a very, very good point. Um, there's something just kind of for general reference. There's something called an authoritative interpretation of the Book of Order that is the General Assembly's understanding of what a passage in the Book of Order means. I think if this amendment passes, we will need several authoritative interpretations to help us understand what it means. And there is definitely interest already in the conversations I've had with the New Church Development Commission, and if this does pass, to work to either make some edits to the amendment or to do some other things that are necessary to make it better. I think for me, the intent is really good. And I hate getting caught up in the details to push back against something that's good, but sometimes it's not quite ready to come out of the oven, as we think about it. So, and that's why we have this process as a church to review these amendments. So we'll turn then to 24D. This one I think will take a little bit less of our time. It's a lot simpler. Um, because so you'll note in this amendment that and on all the remaining slides that there are little parts that are struck out and in italics. So this amendment is focused only on changing one word on about the temporary pastoral relationships. Um, Currently, temporary pastoral relationships are limited to 1 year. This amendment would permit that to become 3 years or 36 months. Um, so the goal here is to simplify process and paperwork. We have learned that there's a lot of work involved in renewing those contracts year after year. In Greater Atlanta, we call these contract call relationships. They're also interim pastor relationships are also temporary. They fit into this big category. And so this would allow us to approve those once every 3 years instead of every year. Um, I have a feeling like this will be a little bit simpler conversation tonight and across the church. But are there any questions on this? Judy?
As someone who's had to renew, I wholeheartedly support.
As I said earlier, I probably should not take a position on any of these amendments, but
But I
but I will say on this one, this would reduce the amount of paperwork that we have to do as presbytery staff. Not by
I'm
not by 2/3, but probably by 40 to 50%. So yeah. I see Jody's hand.
Sorry, I'm on my phone and I can't find all the buttons.
That's fine.
Would this preclude a long-term interim pastor from renegotiating a salary if they sign for the first year and it turns out that they're working more hours or et cetera, et cetera? Seems like that's a chance to revisit that after each year.
It would not. I think we would probably want to make sure, in fact, that all of these relationships include clarity that the compensation, while it is approved as part of that, does need to be revisited on a regular basis just to account for the cost of living as it shifts and changes. So, or as churches learn more. So, yeah, we can absolutely, there's nothing that stops that from happening. But that's also a good reason why it's helpful to review these every year, is it gives us that moment of checking in.
Yeah.
Margaret, I see your hand.
Yes, it's sort of like my question on the other one. Well, and you've explained a little bit about, why this, but I guess one question I have is how many or what percentage or of these kind of temporary pastoral relationships last, beyond a year or two. And so how was, 36 months arrived at?
So I would say an increasing number of pastoral relationships are temporary relationships in general. Um, in terms of those that last beyond that, because in large part because in smaller congregations they are more affordable. Temporary relationships do not have to have Board of Pensions benefits attached to them. So that is some of the substantial savings. I think the cost on what was the thing? The other comment I was going to make, I would say probably at least 40% of our contract call relationships run beyond 1 year. Maybe even more. Contract call and interims, probably more like 60%. Now, do they hit 3 years? Not always. But, we've got some folks who've been in contract call relationships for 8, 10 plus years. So,
So yeah, so I guess there is a distinction. Anyway, interim isn't the only kind
correct.
of situation in which this would apply.
Right.
And I guess I've just not been in a church that had an other kind of temporary, really, pastoral relationship.
Right.
We have contract pastors at Alpharetta. We have one in particular right now, and she's been there gosh, I don't know, several years. But
Mhm.
I mean, it seems like it comes up all the time that we have to renew the contract. And of course, sometimes it's appropriate because, like this last time, she changed the number of hours. And I don't know, Andy, you can probably speak to this. I guess if there's going to be a salary change, then you would need to redo it. But since it's a contract, and
Well, if this goes forward, we make some changes to our forms and our practices and policies that clarify that a salary change doesn't require, it can be done by the session, doesn't need presbytery approval. So
mhm.
that's a great point, though. I probably should put it on my to-do list uh, for July because it feels like this one will probably pass. Any other questions or comments on this one? Let's turn. We're going to tackle two of these at once. Um, it's 24E and 24G. These relate to non-disclosure agreements. 24E attaches to a temporary pastoral relationship, and 24G attaches to an installed pastoral relationship because those end in different ways, so it needs to be prohibited in both cases. The text here is pretty simple. When the temporary pastoral relationship ends, no non-disclosure agreement shall be allowable. A non-disclosure agreement, also known as a confidentiality agreement, is an agreement that outlines confidential material, knowledge, or information that is to remain confidential. Such an agreement binds the party or parties who have signed it and prevents them from discussing any information included in the contract with anyone not authorized by the agreement. So that's the temporary pastoral relationship. And then under installed, it just says at the point, talking in the section G20901, at the point of dissolving the installed relationship, says no non-disclosure agreement shall be allowable. The definition is identical, that these are two different amendments because they're two different sections of the Book of Order. But tonight we can talk about them together. A couple of things to note about this. There is a group called the Advisory Committee on the Constitution that, if you've ever watched General Assembly, anytime an amendment to the Book of Order comes up, they tell you what they think about it. Their job is not to tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but to tell you whether it's consistent. And they want to kind of put it in context and help you understand how it fits with the polity. The Advisory Committee on the Constitution actually, and a lot of in the amendment book, it shows up with their advice in most cases. Um, they have said that our polity has repeatedly said that non-disclosure agreements are not appropriate in the Presbyterian Church. However, that has not stopped some of our churches from using them. So when that happens, we escalate and we move to putting in a constitutional amendment. So this would make the prohibition that already is there explicit and essentially would invalidate any non-disclosure agreement that would be signed because a congregation session, any council of the church, according to this, is not able to enter into such an agreement. Any questions on this one? All right, we'll move on. 24F deals with the section about making accommodations to particular circumstances for our candidates for ministry. This is at G20610. I will note that the original overture here came from the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta. And it has been changed a little bit, but it is originally our overture. The current text requires that a full account of the reasons for an alternative means of a waiver or alternative means to ascertain readiness be included in the minutes of the presbytery. This amendment would change that language from a full account of the reasons to the existence of the waiver with confidential details omitted. It's not necessary to say that it be included in the minutes of the presbytery. If it's an action of the presbytery, it has to be in the minutes. And so it just says that the existence has to be communicated to any presbytery when someone is transferred. So, want to open the floor for any questions on this one? Yeah, Margaret.
Can you say again the circumstances under which
Okay.
a waiver? What is the situation we're talking about here?
Sure.
Again?
So a very talented candidate. I will use one that is not at all connected to this presbytery. A very talented person comes with great qualifications for ministry. He's been accepted into seminary, and the seminary has taken appropriate measures to grant a waiver of the requirement for an undergraduate college degree. However, the Book of Order requires an undergraduate degree. So the presbytery might provide a waiver for in that circumstance. Such a waiver requires a 3/4 vote of the presbytery when it is approved. Another example is an alternative examination for the ordination exams. So if someone is struggling, if they have learning issues, they process information in different ways and don't do so well with a written exam, we can provide them an alternative for that, either an oral exam. There's lots of different formats for that. That also requires a 3/4 vote of presbytery. So this just changes the documentation requirements for that. Any other comments on this one?
So essentially,
Yeah. Go ahead. Judy, were you trying to speak?
yeah, I don't think my microphone's working too well.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. So essentially what this is saying is that the minutes don't have to say the rationale and the reason. It just states simply that there is that documentation there. So
Correct.
it's not disclosing to whomever reads the minutes.
Right. You don't have to lay out the full, you're not having to show someone's full mental health situation or
learning disabilities
right.
or financial needs or whatever the situation is.
Right. Or
Okay.
if you're cutting
Yeah.
another requirement that sometimes gets cut short is time requirements. There are sometimes really good reasons to move back time requirements that don't need to be made public.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Just that. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, or they may need to be spoken publicly, but they don't need to be in the permanent record.
Right. Okay.
So yeah.
Makes sense.
All right. Any other questions on this one? I'll move on to 24H. This is about adding a requirement that our child and youth protection policy also include protection of adults with vulnerabilities. So this is already a pretty complicated sentence. I think any English teacher would probably throw up their hands trying to diagram it. But it's what we've got, and the way to do the way to add this line in, add this requirement in, is to strike an and add and adults with vulnerabilities. So the goal is that each council of the church, session, presbytery, synod, and general assembly have a sexual misconduct policy, a harassment policy, a child, youth, and adults with vulnerabilities protection policy, and an anti-racism policy. And this amendment clarifies that. Any questions on this one?
Well, as an English major, I have a no, I just have a question, and it's punctuation, and I think a slight punctuation change would clarify my question. So is this saying that each of these policies is separate, or is the child, youth, and adults with vulnerabilities protection policy one
That's intended to be one policy.
Okay.
So it would help if there were semicolons. Yes.
Yes, that was yes.
Margaret, if this passes all of the presbyteries, I think you and I need to write an amendment to this to correct the punctuation for General Assembly 2026, because I firmly believe in a policy that protects children and youth and a policy that protects adults with vulnerabilities, but they should be two separate policies.
Okay. Well, and this would
put them all together. So, yeah.
Well, actually, it's unclear.
Exactly. Margaret, let's correct the grammar.
Well, or let's make sure the grammar reflects the actual intent. But yeah.
Lee, I see your hand.
And this is one where you are going to provide some work with clerks of session to make sure that what sessions have is doing what it needs to do?
We can certainly work toward that later on if this is approved. I can't make any guarantees, but I will put it on my to-do list and we'll do what we can. And I will tell you, the best work we have on this, on these kind of policies, usually comes from our other sessions. So whatever session takes the lead on pulling this off is probably going to be the resource we share. So,
and that's fine, just to have some standard
absolutely
trying to meet rather than we have to have a policy and is this one adequate or not? Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and so just so I can be sure I understand at least what Tully is saying, I think he was the one who said we should deal with this. Yeah. So what the apparent intent is here is that there be a misconduct policy, semicolon.
Yes, it's intended that there are 4 policies.
Semicolon, a child and youth policy.
And vulnerable adults.
And protection. Okay, so it's 4 policies.
Right. And so I think to get to Tully's way of doing it without actually having to make a major amendment, you could probably have a child, youth, and adults with vulnerabilities policy that just has 2 different sections that address adults with vulnerabilities. So, and I will say as well, punctuation usually gets corrected in editing when they finalize the book of order. So that the stated clerk can make changes to the book of order without especially around punctuation without amendment. So. But if we need to do it, we'll do it. I mean, Tully was the one who tried to change an A to a D on the floor of General Assembly this summer. So, or was it the other way around? I can't remember.
It can matter. It can matter a lot.
All right. So the next one is 24I is an amendment to G30302D. That section talks about what the presbytery can do, and this has to do with changing the requirement that overtures to General Assembly receive a concurrence. So it strikes language there that requires that overtures receive a concurrence from another presbytery. And it provides explicitly that concurrences still can be done. Because the current Book of Order, before this edition of the Book of Order with this change, was about 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, we had concurrences, but it wasn't talked about. So I do have to mention that I was involved in and this is not trying to toot my own horn, this is just trying to be clear about my role. I was involved in creating this amendment as part of my service on the special committee on the standing rules of the General Assembly. So, um, we what we learned in that work was that this requirement's been in the Book of Order for about 12 years, and over those 12 years, only only one or two overtures have not received a concurrence. So it really hasn't done the intention, which was to reduce the amount of business presented to the assembly. It's basically made life more complicated for presbyteries. There are presbyteries that empowered their council to concur with whatever overtures they wanted to concur with. I think in some cases they empowered their EP and stated clerk to say, "Oh, just concur with it." Concur with it. One presbytery seemed to even say, "Oh, just concur with everything," because they were so we we were not getting the intended benefit of this change, and so the suggestion is let's roll this back. Um, and simplify our lives. Any questions on this one? Callie?
Oh, is something missing from this one? I see a comma, I don't see a period.
So this is like an item in a list. So the
Okay,
comma the list continues. So this is
okay,
one item in the list. That's why there's a comma at the end. Great question.
okay.
Anything else
Things
on
in a
this?
series.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure. Let's see. This is D, so this is the fourth item in a series of probably about
Mm,
Um, I'd say it's about five or six items in this series. Okay. Yeah, there's up to D in this series. So up to E rather. So there are other items. It's things like electing commissioners to GA. That's the kind of stuff there. So yeah, Russ, see your hand.
So Andy, I'm just curious how you balanced the creation of this with your love of Robert's Rules of Order.
The
Do
goal.
we expect that it really is going to make a difference on what comes to the floor of General Assembly if there's not a second?
No, that's what we learned is that we had so many. I can think of. I personally know of exactly one overture that did not receive a concurrence. It was from my previous one of my previous presbyteries. So that's the only reason I know about it. But all of them are listed in PC Biz, so we were able to go back and track it. We asked the staff who deal with these things, and they looked it up, and they were kind of like, "Yeah, we think it's only maybe four or five," and that's over the course of five or six General Assemblies. So and out of sometimes 100 overture, maybe not 100, but sometimes 80 overtures, when only one is not receiving a concurrence, it's not doing what it's intended to do. And if anything, it's blocking the possibility of something rising to our attention. I'm going to turn to the next one, which is 24J. This deals with the number of commissioners to General Assembly. This is another one that started out um, in that special committee on standing rules. I will say that the final version of this is quite different from what we proposed. We were totally fine with this. What we found is that the existing composition of the General Assembly was not working. So if you look at the strikeouts down there, you see it goes up to 48,000. It provides for, I guess that's seven different categories. This is at this assembly, there was, I believe there might, Tully, were we 10 or 12? Were we 8 or 10 at this assembly? I can't ever remember.
There were two presbyteries, Grand Canyon, sorry, Greater Atlanta and Charlotte that had eight,
4 and 4?
4 and 4.
Yeah.
And those are the only two that had 4 and 4.
Yeah. And at the assembly before in 2022, Greater Atlanta was the only presbytery that had 5 and 5. in that 32,000 category. So at this assembly, there were no presbyteries in those top three categories. What we also learned as part of our work with the special committee is that our structure and process is set up to do best with with somewhere between 4 and 500 people. And if we didn't make these adjustments, we would start to dip below that number of commissioners that we really kind of need this core group. We need at least 400, 450 people to do the work in the way that we've become accustomed to doing it. So what we sought to do was to set the number of commissioners at 500. Um, we were going to set that up in a way that let the General Assembly kind of parse that out at each assembly. That was not accepted by the Assembly, but they did come up with this alternative, which changes the different brackets so that we have more, so that we reduce the size of the presbytery to get additional commissioners. So we still have the most is 4 and 4, but there will probably be something like 10 or 12 presbyteries that have that level of representation in 2026 if this is approved. Are there any questions on this one? Hopefully this one's pretty straightforward. So the next one is 24K. I put in the whole segment here just so that you see it in context, but the italicized portion in the middle there is the only thing that's new. So this section of the Book of Order deals with the process for when the stated clerk of a presbytery or a clerk of session receives an allegation of offense related to a member of that congregation or presbytery. The current framing of this, there is some question as to whether or not the clerk has the authority to contact civil authorities to make sure that an allegation of abuse is properly reported. So if there is abuse of a minor or an adult lacking mental capacity, vulnerable adult, we might call it, that is very much, according to the Book of Order at G40302, it is our responsibility as as ordained persons in the church to report things like this to civil authorities. But also in here, we are told that the clerk doesn't do anything except to start a process. You don't share the content of this as at the beginning of that process. So this would clarify that the clerk is to report to civil legal authorities anything related to the physical abuse, neglect, and or sexual molestation or abuse of a minor or adult lacking mental capacity. So that is the amendment here. Again, this feels like it's something that is clear when you take it on balance, but sometimes it's really helpful to put it in this more direct way. Any questions on this one?
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to parse or think through the the list of of abuse of potential abusees, and I guess so the report is required to come, and I believe that is the terminology. They're required reporters or something like that.
Mandatory reporting. Yeah.
Mandatory reporters. So whether, for instance, a parent or a caregiver for an adult also reports.
Mm-hmm. And so that's correct. So, and civil legal authorities will always tell you they would rather receive 2 reports than no reports.
Right.
So I think the goal here is let's find a way to make sure that the church is not somehow complicit in keeping silent.
Mhm.
Right.
I see Judy, Russ, and then William.
Yeah, my question is on this investigating committee.
Mhm.
Is that an internal investigating committee, or is that the civil authority investigating committee?
That is that is part of the existing process. The investigating committee is within the church. It's in church discipline. It's defined
Okay, in the
in the
order.
next section of the
Okay,
Book of Order.
okay.
Yeah. And God help us all that our clerks of session and clerks of presbyteries never have to deal with any of this. We will at some
Right.
point at the presbytery level for sure, but you know that if you're a clerk of session and you don't ever have to, and you have to start an investigating committee, God help you because you're a very rare commodity. But
Yeah.
that's what I exist for here is to walk alongside you in that work. So,
I had to do one
mm,
years ago.
Oh,
yeah, I've had to do one as state clerk of another presbytery, so it happens for sure. Russ, I see your hand.
Andy, really, this is more of a compliance question because there are there have been multiple times that we have made reports to DFACS regarding students in our preschool where they're coming in with either bruises or neglect issues, things of that nature. We have never put that into the church discipline policy since they are participants in the school. Are we missing a step there?
Unless there is some complaint made against a member of the church, then so if it becomes clear that the person involved in the abuse, perpetrating the abuse, is a member of the church, then you need to make sure you're starting church discipline. But otherwise, you do not.
Okay, thank you for the clarity.
Yeah, sure.
Mhm.
It's a very good question. William, I saw your hand a few minutes ago.
I think I'm good.
Okay.
I was just looking at the last complete sentence here where it refers to and or the physical abuse, neglect, and or sexual molestation or abuse of a minor or adult. And then the three words lacking mental capacity. Uh, do we determine that or can't the period to that sentence be after the word adult?
I think the goal was so civil authorities would not be necessarily, so this is actually, I think it's related to what our mandatory reporting requirements are at G40302. So it's echoing the language there. And the general civil authority rule here is you care about those issues related to a minor or adult lacking mental capacity. In the civil world, they might not be directly concerned about that related to someone who is in a different space there. So I think that's why the mandatory reporting is only required for those two very specific categories of persons.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else on this one? One more in the weeds of church discipline. This one is deep in the weeds. So this has to do with administrative leave in a matter of sexual abuse. So you've heard a little bit about our process. Our process begins and this section pertains explicitly to ministers, and I think commissioned ruling elders people who are serving as pastor in a pastoral role that's approved by the presbytery and therefore are subject to the discipline of the presbytery. So in our process, that discipline against such a person begins with an allegation of offense presented to the stated clerk of the presbytery. The one assessment that is made as part of that process is whether the allegation involves the potential um, matter of sexual abuse. And there's a definition in the Book of Order about sexual abuse. Um, and it involves abuse of power or position and also about it could involve age. So and vulnerable adult status. In the current rules, current church discipline, there is no explicit language requiring that it. So there is an assessment made as to whether or not someone who is accused of something should be put on administrative leave, so that to prevent further harm. In the current church discipline, it does not define that leave in any way except that it exists. In the former rules of discipline, it described it as paid administrative leave. And so this amendment adds the word paid back in here to clarify that. And it also notes that you see that there's a couple of little blips of paid in here. And then there's this final sentence, the cost shall be borne by the employing entity whenever possible, or be shared by the presbytery as necessary. So it is always unfortunate when we end up in a situation involving administrative leave, but this gives us a little bit more clarity about how we protect the rights of the accused in such a situation. Any questions on this? All right. Well, so the last item that pops up for your consideration at this upcoming meeting is item 24M. It is not an amendment to the Book of Order, but it is an ecumenical agreement, which requires the approval of the presbyteries. This is called the Episcopal Presbyterian Agreement on the Local Sharing of Ministries. It provides a limited space for the placement of Presbyterian ministers and Episcopal churches, and vice versa. One of the key pieces of this, if you know much about Episcopal practice and liturgy and theology and everything, is what are the words that get said and who can say them and all of that. So one of the very things that's very specific here is that when you're serving in the other denomination, the leader must use their home denomination's communion liturgy. So this would be one of the rare cases where in an Episcopal church, you would hear a Presbyterian prayer or vice versa. This is intended as a next step to implement limited sharing on a local level that was initially suggested in 2008. This is not full communion. So we are in full communion with about 5 or 6 different denominations, which means that we can share sacraments, we can share ministers, and we have very particular rules about that. And it's always it's complicated anytime we get into these conversations, but this is very specifically not full communion. Although one of the interesting pieces of this is that the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church are both in full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So we share a full communion partner. So on that communion liturgy, I wasn't sure how to put this in the slide. On that communion liturgy item, there's actually a very specific line that the presbytery or the bishop can give permission to the minister to use the Lutheran liturgy because that's permitted in both churches. So, yeah, welcome to the world of sacramental theology. I'm really glad Martha's on this call tonight. So this is an agreement that was worked out over a number of years. As best I can tell, it also requires the approval of the Episcopal Church through their General Convention. They met last summer as well, but I don't think that this was considered then because I think we were needed to be for some reason the first to consider this, or it came in after the deadline or something. So this will also require the Episcopal Church USA to approve this before it takes effect. Are there any questions on 24M? Comments too? Make sure I didn't forget any of my points.
Yeah, this is Margaret.
Yeah.
I think I would have questions, except that my sister, who lives in upstate New York, is a member of Tri-Church Parish, which is like a merger, or I don't know what the right language is, of two Methodist congregations and and a Lutheran one, and they rotate ministers.
Mhm. Right.
And it works.
Mhm. Jody, I see your hand.
Yes.
Jody, and then Judy. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm wondering, would that, if you're a guest pastor, what hoops have to be jumped through in order, if I worship at a Episcopal church and they need someone to speak, can they just invite me to even celebrate communion after this is passed? Or do I need approval at like a presbytery level, et cetera, et cetera?
So I think one-off occasions are different than long-term occasions. This is intended to speak solely to the long term. Um, and so it could be a interim pastor, contract call pastor, even an installed pastor. This would be permitted to be an Episcopal priest in the Presbyterian Church. There, you would need the authority, like for an Episcopal priest to step into the Presbyterian Church, you'd need the approval of the presbytery and the approval of the bishop. So you're going to need the same approval on this end. We would call that laboring outside the bounds. And we would, those are highly routine requests. So,
I'm sorry, I just want to be clear because this is actually
oh, sure.
a
Yeah.
real life situation.
Yeah.
So there are no Presbyterian churches in the area where I spend a lot of time in Rhode Island, and the Episcopal Church is looking for someone new. And I thought about offering to preach, but I didn't think that I would be allowed to celebrate communion.
So you would want to talk with the bishop. It's really about what the bishop will permit. In the current structure and in this new structure, because the bishop has a lot of latitude to do what they see fit. So it really, and it kind of in the same way the presbytery does. We can authorize some of this in our current structure, in our current system. This just gives us a clearer process for how we get there, and it's an agreed upon process at the national level, so we can get through it a little bit more easily. So,
And laboring outside the bounds is only necessary if you have a contract outside.
yeah, if it's something, yeah. If you email me and say I want to do a wedding in Marietta, which is outside the bounds of the presbytery, I'm going to be like, just do it. We don't need to approve that.
Okay.
What we need to approve is your service overseas, or your service in another presbytery for an extended period. So, and we like to approve 3 months, but sometimes that's not even necessary. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Judy, did you have a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay. All right. Just saw you unmuted. I wasn't sure. Any other comments or questions on this one? Our resident liturgical theologian, any additional comments beyond
No, I mean, I celebrate this. I think that I find it interesting, this line about leaders use their home denomination communion liturgy. Of course, that shows how different we are in that, as I put in the chat, I mean, Presbyterians have already a great deal of latitude. And, many of the prayers in our Book of Common Worship are already very similar to prayers that are in the Book of Common Prayer. And I could pray a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, and that would be absolutely fine. The issue is coming the other way, I think, right? It's the Episcopalian priests who want to know that that they will still be permitted to use the prayers from the Book of Common Prayer, because that's much more
Mhm.
fixed. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It is a very it clearly it was a sticky issue for this group to sort out. So yeah.
Mm.
Tully, any you know he was on the committee. Any comments?
The number one thing that really stuck out to me when our committee was discussing this was we received this report. The only real action item that our committee took that then GA had to take was we approved the fourth round of bilateral talks between our two denominations. And note that it's the fourth round. The first round of these talks was initiated back in the 90s. So this is like 30 plus years in the making of our two denominations moving closer together. And hopefully one day we will be in full communion, but it may take, hopefully not another 30 years, but it may take another 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the goal very much is full communion. So any other questions or comments on this one? Well, friends, it has been a joy to be with you this evening. I hope this has been helpful. I will note that the Presbytery will meet in our for our winter stated meeting on Saturday, February 8th. We'll be meeting at Eastminster Presbyterian Church in Stone Mountain. That probably is news to all of the location is new information tonight. We have just finalized that over the holidays. Um, the meeting is expected probably to run from 9 to 1, so please do come prepared for good conversation on these amendments. Your conversation and engagement with these is helpful for us. I'm going to share our video tonight with the Presbytery as they take next steps on this, and it's helpful also to know kind of what's going to spark interest around this conversation. So, because we know that people are always interested in the amendments to the Book of Order. So, are there any other final questions tonight? Well, let us close in prayer. Gracious God, you have called us to be your people, given us the gift of your church, and guided us to this time and place together. As we have been commissioned for this conversation, so now commission us to go out from it, to continue to listen and watch and learn from your Spirit at work in our midst. Help us to hear how you are calling us to be more faithful as your church as we consider these amendments as a presbytery. Guide and direct the work we do, that it might always be a part of your glory coming into our world. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Thank you all for joining us tonight.